do want to correct one story, one bit of information. This is only for those whom it may concern. The rest of you can just sit there and wonder what we're talking about. But it was a sister and not a black maid. That's all I'm going to say. Those of you who know will know what I'm talking about. So, that's rare. So now that my reputation is intact once again, well, some of you will have to ask those that appear like they know something. Well, I guess it's good that I'm not then. We are through corroborating the material of the intertestamental period class with Daniel 11 for good reason, because we ran out of verses. But we're not through with the class because we've got 2 whole books of Maccabees to look at. So as you can already tell, we're going to be back, since we didn't teach this Wednesday, we're going to be back in that to begin with tonight. So we're through with Daniel 11. You'll hardly even need that anymore, probably. But we will have the 2 books of Maccabees. I want to continue to study the events of the intertestamental period by sketching the contents of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. This is the period of Israel's history between the Testaments, thus far anyway, that we are really able to concentrate on, and we know quite a lot about, almost, well, I hate to say from month to month, but more often, more frequently than from year to year, at least from every half a year to half a year. We know a lot of material for these years at the beginning of the 2nd century B.C. Thus far, we've covered the following: 1st Maccabees chapters 1 and 2, 2nd Maccabees 1 to 7. Just to let you know what we've covered thus far. You should already have that pretty much down. 1st Maccabees chapters 1 and 2, 2nd Maccabees 1 through 7. Because we're corroborating the material of the ITP class with the events, first of all, in Daniel 11, and once we run out of verses, then in the books of Maccabees. Now, it all began with the revolt in 1st Maccabees 2 under Mattathias, who you should be familiar with by now. We know that his father dies sometime late 166 B.C., and evidently his third-born son, although we can't be dogmatic on that. I think it's Josephus tells us that Judas Maccabeus was the firstborn, but his name doesn't occur first in the genealogical list of 1st Maccabees 2, so maybe that would be a little doubtful. Judas Maccabeus, the third-born son, becomes leader of the group. Let's look at a few verses that say this, that set the scene. 1st Maccabees 2, see, this is material we've already covered. 1st Maccabees 2, verse 66, with verses 69 to 70. Judas Maccabeus, Mattathias is speaking now. This is his death and instructions that he gives at his death. Has been strong and brave from boyhood. He shall be your commander in the field. Now, he said that Simeon, perhaps one of the older ones, is the wise one, follow his counsel, but Judas Maccabeus is to be the new leader once I die. Then Mattathias blessed them and was gathered to his fathers. He died in the year 166 according to the Christian calendar, 146 or 45 or 47, around that period for the Seleucid era. But he died in the year 166 B.C. and was buried by his sons in the family tomb at Modin, and all Israel raised a loud lament for him. Then in chapter 3, verses 1 to 9, we haven't looked at this yet. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. Then Judas Maccabeus came forward in his father's place. He had the support of all his brothers and his father's followers. They carried on the fight for Israel with zest. And this probably gets into a little poetry of him here. That's why it's kind of set off probably in your version. He enhanced his people's glory. He put on his breastplate like a giant, and girt himself with weapons of war, and fought battle on battle. He guarded his army with his sword. He was like a lion in his exploits, like a lion's whelp roaring for prey. He hunted and tracked down the lawless. He blasted the troublers of his people. This is a description of Judas. The lawless cowered in fear of him. All evildoers were confounded. The cause of freedom prospered in his hands. He provoked many kings to anger, but he made Jacob glad by his deeds. He is remembered forever in blessing. He passed through the towns of Judea. He destroyed the godless there. He turned wrath away from Israel. His fame spread to the ends of the earth, and he rallied a people who were near destruction. And that certainly is true. That's really the whole story, the whole theme of the story of Maccabees, and the ending verses there in our section in Daniel 11, that the people of Israel were a people near destruction until he rallied them. Furthermore, 2 Maccabees 5:27. 2 Maccabees doesn't deal with Mattathias. Either the writer was ignorant of that, therefore the book has mistakes, or he just chose to pass over it. 2 Maccabees 5:27. But Judas also called, this is after Apollonius has been sent in to Jerusalem and kills quite a few people. Also called Maccabeus, with about 9 others, escaped into the desert, where he and his companions lived in the mountains, fending for themselves like the wild animals. They remained there, living on what vegetation they found, so as to have no share in the pollution, that is, the Hellenistic pollution of the people. So if you're familiar basically with 1 Maccabees chapter 2, then you know about the revolt, what took place at Modin, what Mattathias did as a result of this renegade Jew stepping forward to obey the Syrian king's commands, and how all of this has begun. Now, hopefully in a couple of messages we will cover it from that point, from the point of the death of Mattathias, beginning now, to the death of Judas Maccabeus. Then we'll pick up with brothers Jonathan and Simon and so forth and finish that on out. So hopefully in 2 messages we'll be able to go. That would take us over, I think, into chapter 9 of 1 Maccabees, where, the middle of chapter 9, where Judas dies. So in a couple of messages we'll have to deal with Judas Maccabeus as the new leader of the people. And the way I want to look at this, to keep it best in mind for you, is by means of an outline, where we'll deal with the chronologically successive campaigns of Judas against the Syrians. Generally, as you'll find tonight, it'll be against one particular man as a general or a governor or some type of leader of the forces of Antiochus Epiphanes. You don't find Epiphanes, by the way, coming out personally fighting against Judas Maccabeus. Maybe that's one thing I need to say to begin with, because you'd think those would be the two against one another, Judas Maccabeus and Antiochus Epiphanes. But Epiphanes, as we'll find out later on, maybe not tonight, maybe next week, he's going to be away in Persia and in Parthia for a large section of this time. So it's going to be leaders that he has entrusted the control of the remaining part of the Syrian army to, that will be led in battle against, and for the most part, disastrous battle against Judas Maccabeus. So, I guess we'll number it this way. Number 1, the first campaign of Judas Maccabeus. The first campaign of Judas Maccabeus against Apollonius. Sometimes they'll have a name, sometimes it'll be in general. Against Apollonius. This will be first, and we'll go through the books and put them together, 1 and 2 Maccabees. This will be 1 Maccabees, only found in 1 Maccabees, chapter 3, verses 10 to 12. See, we just stopped with verse 9 in our reading. So we've got to fill in every verse as we work our way through here. Okay, before reading that, one thing we have to deal with is this man Apollonius. We're told in verse 10 that he brings a large contingency of soldiers from Samaria, which means maybe he could have been some type of leader under Epiphanes that was stationed in Samaria. But the name Apollonius was a very common name for Syrian Greeks. We find many people with a name, with the name of Apollonius, right in the two books of Maccabees. Therefore, it's a little difficult to ascertain to whom this account applies. So I'll have to mention some of the men by the name Apollonius. We'll try to determine which one it is. Who is Apollonius? First of all, he could be the son of Thraseus. We'll look up these accounts here. The son of Thraseus, who was governor of Cilicia under Seleucus IV, which remember was the king on the throne before Epiphanes. 2 Maccabees 3 verses 5 to 7. Because as you read through the books, you'll see this name Apollonius popping up time after time. And we have 3 or 4 or more different men by the same name Apollonius. So we're trying to determine which one 1 Maccabees 3, 10 to 12 has reference to. Unable to get the better of Onias, he went to Apollonius, son of Thraseus, the governor of Cilicia and Phoenicia, and alleged, this is Simon, who's against Onias, the good high priest, that the treasury at Jerusalem was full of untold riches. Remember how we've read this before. Indeed, the total of the accumulated balances was incalculable and did not correspond with the account for the sacrifices. He suggested that these balances might be brought under the control of the king, and when Apollonius met the king, then he gave him this information. Of course, the high priest says this is nothing but a deposit held in trust for widows and orphans, and is part of the account of Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, down in verses 10 and 11. So, since he lives back during, and he's a ruler, a governor of Cilicia and Phoenicia, back under the time of Seleucus IV, this doesn't appear to be the Apollonius that we need to discover in 1 Maccabees 3. As a matter of fact, other records tell us that whenever Epiphanes came to the throne, then Apollonius, the son of Thraseus, retired to Miletus. And that's the end of his life as far as Maccabees are concerned. Therefore, it most likely is true that Apollonius as son of Thraseus is only dealt with in 2 Maccabees 3, verses 5 to 7. Okay, then we have another man by the name Apollonius, who is the son of the first Apollonius, the son of Thraseus. So the second Apollonius is the son of the first, and he becomes governor of the same territory, Cilicia, Phoenicia, this realm. However, he doesn't become governor until much, much later during the reign of Demetrius. Demetrius is going to be a future king after Eupator, I believe. He'll be the next king. We haven't even gotten to him, although I've mentioned him by name. You've got Antiochus Epiphanes on your chart, then Antiochus Eupator, and then you've got Demetrius. Demetrius, as well as this Apollonius, spent time as captives together in Rome. Remember, Epiphanes for 12 years was a captive in Rome. So they got to know one another real well. So whenever Demetrius comes to the throne after Eupator, then he raises up his friend, who now also is in Syria, Apollonius, to become a chief official of his. That's 1 Maccabees 10:69. That's where you'll find this man by the name of Apollonius dealt with. But since that is during the reign of Demetrius, that seems highly unlikely. The third place, we have another man by the name of Apollonius, distinguished from the others by the fact that his father's name was Menesthius, or Menesthius, is maybe the best pronunciation. 2 Maccabees 4, verse 4 and verse 21. Apollonius, the son of Menesthius. 2 Maccabees 4, and 21, that he was the chief official under Epiphanes. You just see mentioned there, Onias realizing that Simon's rivalry was dangerous, and that Apollonius, son of Menesthius, governor of Cilicia and Phoenicia. The only problem is we keep running into governors by the name Apollonius that are governors of almost the exact same territory, if not the exact same territory, which makes it a little confusing, assuming these men are different. Well, since one was said to be the son of Thraseus and another the son of Menesthius, I would think that they would probably be different people. He may be the man of 1 Maccabees 1:29. Probably. Doesn't mention the man's name here, but we know that he was a high revenue official. And this is exactly what it's termed in 1 Maccabees 1:29. 2 years later, the king sent to the towns of Judea a high revenue official who arrived at Jerusalem with a powerful force. There's a good chance that this third Apollonius that we're talking about now would be that man. He probably also was the man, and this is a little more definite because the name occurs, of 2 Maccabees chapter 5, verses 24 and 26. He's the one who comes into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, whenever the people aren't fighting, and he brings out all of his array of soldiers, military might, to parade before them so they can come and review the troops, and whenever they come out to review the troops, then he slaughters all of the people. Probably the same man. But our question would be, is this the man of 1 Maccabees 3:10 to 12? Well, it would either be this man or the next one I'm going to mention. Probably this third one, but we can't be dogmatic on that. Either this man or yet another Apollonius. There's one mentioned, for instance, in 2 Maccabees 12:2 that appears to be different from these that we've mentioned thus far. Let's just assume, however, that it will be the third one. I doubt that makes a whole lot of difference one way or the other to us in this church, whether it was the third or the fourth one. Well, let's just assume that it was the third one. Therefore, he probably was the governor of Samaria. The others had been governors of Cilicia and Phoenicia. He probably was a governor of Samaria under Epiphanes, who is the first leader of the Syrian forces, according to 1 Maccabees 3:10 to 12, to come against Judas. By the way, this account that we have here is the first recorded organized battle of the Maccabean period. We've got a lot of guerrilla skirmishes going on prior to this in chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees, but this is the first recorded, organized battle between the Maccabees and the Syrians. This man is mentioned as well in Josephus' Antiquities, Book 12, Chapter 7, Paragraph 10. Generally just write that 12 period, 7 period, 10 period. Antiquities 12, 7, 10. If I ever give that to you, just write it 12 period, 7 period, 10 period. Antiquities 12, 7, 10. Apollonius, the man slain by Judas in 1 Maccabees 3. Okay, let's read the account then. I just told you who wins, but let's read it anyway. It's very brief. They get larger and longer as we go along. Apollonius, this is the first, remember, recorded organized victory of the Maccabees over the Syrians. Apollonius now collected a Gentile force and a large contingent from Samaria, so maybe he was the governor of Samaria. That's where we get our suggestion from of him as a governor of Samaria, to fight against Israel. When Judas heard it, in other words, this is Judas' make it or break it time. This is where he proves his manhood. This is where he proves his worthiness to be the successor to his father Mattathias. What would have happened to the Maccabees, in other words, if Judas would have lost in his first battle? That wouldn't have gone very well with him or with the people. So it's important in a first battle to win the first battle. When Judas heard of it, he marched out to meet him and defeated and killed him. Very short explanation of what happened. Just one. And Apollonius ends up dead. Many of the Gentiles fell, and the rest took to flight. From the arms they captured, Judas took the sword of Apollonius and used it in his campaigns for the rest of his life. So it seems like this kind of sets the scene then. This is a key battle to understanding the rest of, at least the episode of Judas' life in the book of Maccabees. Because it's like David taking the sword of Goliath. And maybe it was founded on that principle, Judas taking the sword of Apollonius and using it throughout the rest of his life. And notice it said in verse 12 that he used it in his campaigns for the rest of his life. And that's what we're studying, each of these campaigns. So the first campaign against Apollonius ends up with a victory on the side of Judas, 1 Maccabees 3:10-12. Okay, the second campaign was against Seron, S-E-R-O-N. S-E-R-O-N. The second campaign against Seron, 1 Maccabees 3:13-24. Again, this second campaign is not covered over in 2 Maccabees. We'll go over there and work on that like a patchwork quilt here in a moment whenever we have to corroborate the material from 1 Maccabees with 2. Okay, let's read the account here. He's one of the leaders. He's one of the generals, evidently. He's called one who commands the army in Syria. I doubt he's one of the highest ones, although he could have been, and Lysias took over after he died. We know Lysias really becomes one of the most important ones, as we'll see like down in verse 38 of this chapter. So it could be that Seron was more important until his defeat, and then Lysias becomes that way, but he probably was some type of general controlling the forces of Epiphanes in Syria. So we'll start reading in verse 13. When Seron, who commanded the army in Syria, heard that Judas had mustered a large force consisting of all his loyal followers of military age, then he said to himself, I will win a glorious reputation in the empire by making war on Judas and his followers who defy the royal edict. So he's kind of controlled by pride here. And let me say something else before getting too far into the teaching tonight. Epiphanes, as well as all of the political and military leaders of Syria, whenever they first detected this Jewish resistance movement on the rise, had no idea the extent that it was at that time or that it would become. I've said before, and it's certainly true, that many of the tactics of Judas and the brothers that come after him are patterned after the so-called guerrilla war tactics, a hit-and-run type of thing, although that's not always true. It seems like Epiphanes just thought we're dealing with a band of a couple of renegades down there, and we just need to go ahead and snuff those people out so we can get on with our affairs. You see the way they deal with Judas, like in this first battle and in this second one, it's kind of in a lackadaisical manner. We'll send some people down there to deal with them. They have no idea how strong, how widespread the resistance movement is in Israel. And they're not going to know that till about the third campaign. They realize we're dealing with something very, very serious down there. And of course, it's a little bit too late because Judas has already got all the so-called momentum flowing on his side. The first battle gets them going, and we'll see from the second one that all of the momentum comes over to the side of the Maccabees. Although they are vastly outnumbered and continue so to be vastly outnumbered. We know, according to Daniel 11, Hebrews chapter 11, that God is with the Maccabees. It's not just their cunning and their strength or their hit-and-run, hide-and-seek tactics that give them the victory. If we believe the reports of the Old and New Testament, Daniel 11 and Hebrews 11, we know that God was with these people. Seron was reinforced by a strong contingent of renegade Jews. You see them popping up again, who marched up to help him take vengeance on Israel. When he reached the pass of Beth-horon, Judas advanced to meet him with a handful of men. When his followers saw the host coming against them, they said to Judas, how can so few of us fight against so many? Besides, we have had nothing to eat all day, and we are exhausted. Judas replied, many can easily be overpowered by a few. It makes no difference to heaven to save by many or by few. That's an allusion from 1 Samuel. And what else is interesting here is notice that he doesn't refer to God as God, but this euphemism, or whatever you want to call it, of heaven. We pointed this out when we studied Maccabees. You won't say God, you'll find heaven, heaven, heaven. But that's not just, this gets back into the Midrashim and the Targumim. You'll find this is very frequent in the Aramaic Targumim. Remember, they like to avoid these extreme examples of anthropomorphisms. And so rather than refer to God actually as a being, that a lot of times they would substitute the term heaven. And you can find it in the Aramaic Targumim. They'll substitute the term heaven for God. We happen to have it capitalized here. It wouldn't be necessarily capitalized, but you'd know what you mean by that. Well, what do I mean by this in pointing it out? What? Maybe you don't know this. Maybe you do. There's a big discussion that's gone on for decades and decades among theologians concerning the gospel accounts. That in Matthew always talks about the kingdom of heaven. The other gospel writers always talk about the kingdom of God. When you find parallel passages where we're talking about the same sermon given by Jesus, the same time period, the same events surrounding it, Mark will speak of the kingdom of God. Matthew will speak of the kingdom of heaven. Is there a difference? A lot of people make a big difference between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven. But probably there is no difference between them. Probably they are synonymous terms. But Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience who's used to, from the Aramaic Targumim, who's used to seeing heaven put in there for the name of God. So it's not just something we find in the books of Maccabees. You'll find it all through the Gospel of Matthew. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. Why didn't it call it the kingdom of God? The other Gospels do, but not Matthew. Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience. So that's helpful to know. Victory does not depend on numbers. Strength comes from God alone, we could say. Our enemies come filled with insolence and lawlessness to plunder and to kill us and so forth, but we are fighting for our lives and our religion, and God will crush them. See, it's always heaven. Heaven will crush them before our eyes. You need not be afraid of them. And you see, if we weren't reading this on the basis of our understanding of Hebrews 11 and Daniel 11, this could just be a fairy tale. Because we find this in other apocryphal books, how the Jews slaughtered some enemies. Well, we don't know whether that's true or not. Especially when you see tremendous results come from only a handful of men. Is it reliable? Is it dependable? Well, you really couldn't judge just from knowing the books of Maccabees. You would have to know something else. Because when do you trust the Jews and their fancy legends and so forth? When he had finished speaking, he launched a sudden attack, and Siron and his army broke before him. They pursued them down the pass of Beth-horon as far as the plain, and some 800 of the enemy fell, and the rest fled to Philistia. So this large victory really gives Judas an additional head start, as the first victory did. And in verses 25 to 30, you see finally Epiphanes begins to take Judas seriously. Verses 25 through 30. Thus Judas and his brothers began to be feared. It's taken 2 campaigns so far. An alarm spread to the Gentiles all around. His fame reached the ears of the king, and the story of his battles was told in every nation. When King Antiochus heard this news, he flew into a rage and ordered all the forces of his empire to be assembled, an immensely powerful army. He opened his treasury and gave a year's pay to his troops. That was something difficult to do, ordering them to be prepared for any duty, but he found that his resources were running low. That's because he'd given too many gifts out. We've read those verses 29 and 30 before. So that brings us then to the next campaign. The third campaign is against Lysias, Lysias. It's against Lysias. 1 Maccabees 3, verse 38 through 4:27. This is a large section. It's an important battle, therefore. Now, you might notice I skipped over a few verses. Let me tell you what's going on meanwhile, and then we'll have to pick up with this story next week. So here's what's going on, then we'll come back to meanwhile next week. Meanwhile, Antiochus Epiphanes, the king himself in person, is going to travel to Persia. Verses 31 through 37. that middle section that I skipped over, verses 31 to 37. Epiphanes is going to travel to Persia, evidently for a couple of reasons. Number one, to put down a rebellion, a revolt among some of the Parthians, Bactrians, Persians, the eastern part of his empire. And number two, he's going to gather new finances. We just read there in verses 29 and 30 that his treasury is low. So he's going to try to increase his treasury. How? By robbing the temples of pagan deities in the eastern part of his empire. So you have to know that to know why Epiphanes is not involved in all of the affairs of the Maccabees. Epiphanes will not be involved. The next time we see him, he'll be almost dead. And that will be the account of his death. So Epiphanes has gone to Persia. 1 Maccabees 3, 31 to 37. For a time he was much perplexed, that is, Epiphanes, because his treasury is low. Then he decided to go to Persia, collect the tribute due from the provinces, and raise a large sum of ready money. He left Lysias, the distinguished member of the royal family, as viceroy of the territories between Euphrates and the Egyptian frontier. I mean, that's almost his whole empire. He's just on the other side of Euphrates. He also appointed him guardian of his son Antiochus, Jupiter. We'll see him later on. He'll come to the throne after Epiphanes dies, until his return. He transferred to Lysias half the armed forces, together with the elephants, and told him all that he wanted done, especially to the population of Judea and Jerusalem.
For the continuation of this message,
Appointed him guardian of his son Antiochus, Jupiter. We'll see him later on. He'll come to the throne after Epiphanes dies, until his return. He transferred to Lysias half the armed forces, together with the elephants, and told him all that he wanted done, especially to the population of Judea and Jerusalem. Against these, Lysias was to send a force and break and destroy the strength of Israel, and those who were left in Jerusalem to blot out all memory of them from the place. He was to settle foreigners in all their territory and allot the land to the settlers. The other half of the forces the king took with him and set out from Antioch, his capital, in the year 147. He crossed Euphrates and marched through the upper provinces. Let's quickly return over to Daniel to remind ourselves of something here. I said we run out of verses just because we've already summarized verses 33 through 35. But verses 33 through 35 still concern the material at which we're now looking. I said it probably goes down to somewhere around the time of the death of Judas Maccabaeus. But these verses in Daniel 11, they that understand among the people will instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, by spoil for many days. We're seeing that and have seen that and will see that. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. Many will cleave to them with flattery. Some of them of understanding shall fall to try them to purge, to make them white even to the time of the end. Well, that's going on, you see, during this period. The Maccabees won't be successful in every endeavor, in every single campaign of theirs. There'll be times when they're not. There'll be times when they're defeated. So it's going to be back and forth, back and forth. So remember, we're still talking about those verses. Those verses didn't just end, let's say, with 167 BC. They probably go down as far as 161 to 160 BC, which is the date of the death of Judas. Okay, back to 1 Maccabees 3. We see that he leaves Lysias in charge, who then picks 3 of what are called the king's friends. They are generals here. He picks 3 important men: Ptolemaeus, their names are spelled for you in verse 38, Nicanor, and Gorgias. Ptolemaeus, Nicanor, and Gorgias. Lysias is in control of almost the entire empire now, because Epiphanes has left for Persia and Bactria and Parthia, and half of his forces have been left with Lysias, who of course will then keep some for himself and divide other troops with these three select men, Ptolemaeus, Nicanor, and Gorgias, to go against Judea. Let me briefly explain what happens, kind of outline it for you, and from verse 38 through verse 27 of the next chapter, and then we'll read some of the material. Gorgias tries to surprise Judas at night, come upon him at night, surprise him to defeat him, but he can't even find Judas. Well, that's true of guerrilla warfare. It'd be hard to find these guerrillas. So while Gorgias at night is looking for Judas, Judas sneaks up on Nicanor and routs him with a great victory. The Battle of Emmaus, which then is going to open up the road to Jerusalem for the Jewish rebels, which is really what they're after. And I think something else I probably need to do before even going on. Well, I don't guess I need a transparency. If you can kind of picture Sea of Galilee. No, let's get it bigger. Here's Syria. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, like that. Here's Syria up here. And we get down, this is Israel. Here's the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Jerusalem down here. Emmaus is another town down here. They're doing a lot of fighting right here in the middle territory. You got Galilee up here, and you've got Judea down here, and you've got Samaria in between. And remember, it was this man from Samaria in verse 10 that's fighting against him. They're doing a lot of fighting here, the Maccabees in Samaria. Their purpose, of course, is to get down to Jerusalem. That's the holy city. That's where the temple has been desecrated, and they want to rededicate it and consecrate the Lord's service there. So they're fighting right here in Samaria. They're going to have to go through Emmaus. You remember Luke 24 and the two disciples on the road to Emmaus? That's a city not far from Jerusalem. They're going to go through Emmaus here in this battle with Nicanor that he wins. That's going to open the road for them to get down to Jerusalem. That's going to take care of this campaign. I'll have to get to a later campaign. But I'll tell you anyway, outline what they're going to do. Then what they want to do, they hear news from other Jews that the Jews are having trouble up here in Galilee, which is up north. And then they hear that they're also having trouble over here in Gilead, which is on the other side of the Jordan River, which is on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Therefore, they're going to go and send some of his brothers, Simon and Jonathan, to go and help deliver the Jews in these territories, bring those people and repopulate Judea and Jerusalem. Bring those Jews there, bring them back down here to the south. So it's kind of like whenever Joshua came into the land of Israel. You remember there was a certain strategy that we covered in Old Testament introduction. We've got the Sea of Galilee, we've got the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, Egypt down here. Remember, they come around through Moab, the plains of Moab. They're right here across from Jericho. They cross the Jordan River back in Joshua's day. They take Jericho. And what is it? It's the divide and conquer, the old divide and conquer plan. You come in and take the central part of the territory. Then you get your enemies divided between north and south, so they have to fight on two fronts, as well as yourself. But then take one at a time. Then defeat those down south and defeat those up north. It was a divide and conquer. He had a certain plan to follow, Joshua, in order. You have to go step by step through Joshua's book, and you can see there's a certain plan, a certain strategy. It's the divide and conquer strategy of the Israelites under him. Well, Maccabaeus, Judas Maccabaeus, has a similar plan to deal, first of all, with the south, then to deal with the north and the east at the same time. So, with that in mind, we see that he's going to be successful, by the way, in this battle. Okay, verses, to break this section down further, verses 38 through 41. By the way, notice right there in the end of verse 40, you see the name Emmaus. So we know we're talking about Emmaus here. It's going to become the important battle. And there are some other ones that are around in this territory. All these cities are not that far from Jerusalem. Verses 38 to 41, we see Lysias picking his men. Verse 42 down through 45, we see the cry of Judas and his brothers because of the straits that they found themselves in. 42 through 45. Judas and his brothers saw that their plight had become grave, with the enemy encamped inside their frontiers. You see, Syria has come all the way down almost to Jerusalem now. They learnt two of the commands which the king had given for the complete destruction of the nation. So they're crying out to God. Then beginning in verse 46, they have some public times of fasting and putting on of sackcloth, reminiscent of Old Testament times of humbling the nation before the Lord. They assembled at an important Old Testament city, Mizpah, an important city from Samuel's days, remember. Opposite Jerusalem, for in former times Israel had a place of worship at Mizpah. That day they fasted, put on sackcloth, sprinkled ashes on their heads, tore their garments. They unrolled the scroll of the law, seeking the guidance which Gentiles seek from images of their gods. They brought the priestly vestments, the first fruits, the tithes. They presented Nazarites who had completed their vows, and they cried to heaven. Verse 55, Judas then appointed leaders of the people, officers over thousands, and so forth. Thereupon the army moved and took up their positions to the south of Emmaus, where Judas thus addressed them. Prepare for action. He says in verse 59, better die fighting than look on while calamity overwhelms our people in the holy place, but it will be as heaven wills. So that all is preparation then. Verses 46 through 60 are preparation for encounters with Nicanor, Gorgias, and Lysias. Ptolemaeus doesn't seem to figure in too much here, but I'm sure the whole story is not told us here anyway. That's all preparation down to the end of chapter 3. Okay, then in chapter 4, we're still here under this third campaign, which will take us to verse 27 of this chapter. Chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, we have the attempt by Gorgias, remember, to locate and surprise Judas by night. Gorgias, taking a detachment of 5,000 men and 1,000 picked cavalry, set out by night to attack the Jewish army and fall upon them unawares. His guides were men from the citadel, or from the Acra. But Judas had word of this. He had spies, in other words. And he had his soldiers moved out to attack the king's army in Emmaus, while its forces are still divided. Gorgias reached the camp of Judas during the night, but found no one there. He set out to search for them in the hills, thinking, these Jews are running away from us. Meanwhile, starting with verse 6, we see Judas attacking the camp of Nicanor. At daybreak there was Judas in the plain with 3,000 men. Though they had not all the armor and swords that they needed or wanted, they saw the Gentiles' camp strongly fortified with breastworks, while mounted guards, seasoned troops, patrolled round it. And we go on to see victory, verse 15. The Gentiles broke and fled to the plain. Judas and his force then broke off the pursuit and returned. He said, curb your greed for spoil. There is more fighting before us. Gorgias and his force are in the hills nearby. Stand firm now against our enemies. Fight, and after that plunder as you please. Before Judas had finished speaking, an enemy patrol appeared reconnoitering from the hills. And verse 22, they all fled to Philistia. So then from verse 6 through verse 22, he's successful in the defeat of Nicanor, and evidently of Lysias here as well, assuming that Lysias has gone out, although that's not certain. And this is preparing them because they're taking Emmaus. It's going to prepare them to go to Jerusalem. And then we've got verses 23 through 27 to finish this section. Verses 23 through 27. And we have the gladness of the Jews and the sorrow of the Syrians. The Jews sang songs of thanksgiving and praised heaven, for it is right, because his mercy endures forever. The gladness of the Jews. The sadness of the Syrians on hearing the news, verse 27, Lysias was overwhelmed with disappointment because Israel had not suffered the disaster he had hoped for. So, campaign 1 against Apollonius, Judas wins. Campaign 2 against Seron, Judas wins. Campaign 3 against Lysias and his men, Ptolemaeus, Nicanor, Gorgias, Judas wins as well. And chapter 8 of 2 Maccabees probably fits in around this time. Chapter 8 deals with some miscellaneous things. Chapter 8 of 2 Maccabees probably fits into the time period of the third campaign. 1 Maccabees 3:38 through 4:27. Okay, a fourth campaign. We'll probably only have time to maybe cover this one and one more. Fourth campaign, again, will be against Lysias. Lysias, of course, is not dead. 1 Maccabees 4:28 through 35. The time period, we must be down to the second half of 165 BC. I mean, August, September, October, somewhere along there of 165 BC. These other battles have obviously been fought in the end or the beginning of 165, depending on how far we go back, depending on whether we're taking into account 2 Maccabees chapter 8. So notice verse 28. In the following year, Lysias, gathered 60,000 picked infantry. Remember, Judas only has 3 with him. 60,000 picked infantry and 5,000 cavalry to make war on the Jews. They marched to Idumea. They're coming down in the realm, through the realm of the Philistines. Verse 34. So they joined battle, and Lysias lost about 5,000 men in the close fighting. When he saw his own army routed, and Judas' army full of daring, ready to live or die nobly, he departed for Antioch. There collected a force of mercenaries in order to return to Judea with a much larger army than before, but of course he'll return at a later time. So there's a short account, verses 28 through 35. The fourth campaign, the second one against Lysias, but the fourth campaign. Now this probably is the most important campaign thus far, because it brings them into Jerusalem proper. They've been on the outskirts in Emmaus with the earlier victories. This actually brings them into Jerusalem, where we're going to see them cleanse, restore, rededicate the temple. 1 Maccabees 4:36 through 61. And 2 Maccabees 10, the first 8 verses. Now this is very important here. I think we need to read a large section of this. They're not just fighting to be fighting. What's happened is Jerusalem, the temple, daily sacrifice, the Lord's holy place, the Lord's altar, it's all been desecrated by these pagans, and so they're very, very concerned to get to Jerusalem. They're not just fighting at random. They have a battle plan. They're very concerned to get to Jerusalem and be successful and be victorious there. And they are through this battle, through this defeat of Lysias. So let's start in verse 36. Look at this. Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been crushed, let us go up to Jerusalem to cleanse the temple and to rededicate it." That's what they're after here. So that's very important for them. So now we're going to have a brief, temporary cessation of accounts of military battles and victories and defeats here in 1 Maccabees, and it's going to take on a religious tone. It has to, because now they're concerned just about Jerusalem. They'll pick up with battles later on. So the whole army was assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the temple laid waste. You see, Judas, some of these probably hadn't seen even Jerusalem, let alone the temple or the temple area, for 3 or more years. Remember, it's been 3 years, from 168 to 165, that the temple has been desecrated and no one has restored it. So they may have not even seen the place for 3 years. And you know how important Jerusalem is for a Jew to make a pilgrimage there. Everything traces itself back to Jerusalem as your holy city. So it could be, it was a very momentous experience for them to be back to Jerusalem, just like the Jews whenever they finally got their city back in the Wailing Wall. The Jews just cried and cried, the young boys who had never seen it, who had grown up and had never seen the walls of the city, the old so-called Wailing Wall, the western wall of the city. They'd never even seen that because it had belonged to the Arabs as long as these Jewish boys had been born. Until 1967, just a few years ago. And there was a lot of crying and weeping, and I could tell you a lot of tales about that are very interesting. We'll get into that sometime with Jewish history, but they were supposed to be the soldiers that actually were responsible for taking the wall to report back to commanders over, their walkie-talkies. And there was nothing over the walkie-talkies until shortly here came crying and here came Jewish singing. They weren't reporting anything, that we'd won or haven't won or send more supplies or bring in more men. These young 18, 19, 20-year-old Jewish soldiers who had finally taken and for the first time in their life seen the Wailing Wall and been able to go up and touch it and pray before it. That's why it's so holy to them. It wasn't time to report anything back to superiors. There was just a lot of crying and a lot of wailing, and a lot of singing of Jewish hymns, and that's all the commanders heard over the walkie-talkies. Well, anyway, then Judas detailed troops to engage the garrison at the citadel. Now, we're going to come back to that later. That's one little phrase that seems to be connected with the later portion of the book. And they're not able to take the citadel at this time. I think it's about 26 years. We're still going to have a Syrian garrison or guard here in the citadel. It's also called the Akra, A-K-R-A or A-C-K-R-A, spelled different ways, the Akra, or the citadel. While he cleansed the temple, it was the Syrian fortification and outpost there that actually watched over the city of Jerusalem to keep everything in check, like the Council of Antony in the New Testament. When he cleansed the temple, he selected priests without blemish. Now it takes on the religious tone. Devoted to the law, they purified the temple, removing to an unclean place the stones which defiled it. They discussed what to do. Now listen to this. They discussed what to do with the altar of burnt offering which was profaned, and rightly decided to demolish it for fear it might become a standing reproach to them because it had been defiled by the Gentiles. Now we're back to the Talmud, case decisions. What do you do? The law of Moses doesn't tell you what to do whenever the Syrians take your temple and set up some altar of Zeus on it. So you've got to have some wise men, and it says here they discussed it. They tried to consider, now what's the wisest thing? Just use the same material here and just trust that God counts it as purified, or get rid of it and bring in new material? Well, the author tells us that they chose the right thing by getting rid of it and bringing in something new. They therefore pulled down the altar and stored away the stones in a fitting place on the temple hill until a prophet should arise who could be consulted about them. This is a verse we've used before, but you never knew the context. You see how much better you understand something? We just would run to this and look at it. That there were no official prophets in Israel in the period between the Testaments. And the books of Maccabees will admit that. So they're very concerned. Evidently none of the wise men could tell them what to do with those stones, because they were stones part of the Lord's holy altar. We know we can't use them now, but what can we do with them? Well, we'll wait for a prophet to come and tell us. As far as we know from the New Testament, no prophet ever came, because John was wanting to talk about someone else entirely than the old stones on the altar. And he was their next prophet, John Baptist. They took unhewn stones, just as Exodus chapter 20 had taught them. They took unhewn stones as the law commands and built a new altar on the model of the previous one. They rebuilt the temple. This is a rebuilding of the temple. Restored its interior and consecrated the temple courts. They renewed the sacred vessels and the lampstand, brought the altar of incense and the table into the temple. They burn incense on the altar, lit the lamps of the lampstand to shine within the temple. When they had put the bread of the presence on the table, mistranslated the shewbread in the King James Version, and hung the curtains, and all their work was completed, then early on the 25th day of the 9th month, the month Kislev, in the year 165 BC, sacrifice was offered as the law commands on the newly made altar of burnt offering. And we know from chapter 1 of this book, that was exactly to the day, 3 years later, from 168 to 165, whenever the temple is restored and sacrifice is resumed. On the anniversary of the day when the Gentiles had profaned it, on that very day, 3 years later, it was rededicated with hymns of thanksgiving to the music of harps, lutes, and cymbals. And all the people prostrated themselves, worshiping and praising heaven that their cause had prospered. They celebrated the rededication of the altar for 8 days. There was great rejoicing as they brought burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings and thank offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with golden wreaths and ornamental shields. They renewed the gates, priest rooms, and so forth. Then Judas, his brothers, and the whole congregation of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness at the same season each year for 8 days, beginning on the 25th of Kislev. If you look over in John chapter 10 then, this is our only New Testament reference to this intertestamental holy day, holiday, feast period. It's the only one, and you'd have to know something about the period between the Testaments to know what this reference was. John 10:22, and it was at Jerusalem the feast of the dedication. Well, dedicate what? That's not in the Old Testament. There was a feast of ingathering, a feast of tabernacles, called a feast of booths, feast of Pentecost, called a feast of weeks. There was the Passover, there was Day of Atonement. Feast of dedicating what? Dedication of the Lord's altar and the Lord's holy temple. So it evidently was still practiced up to this day. This would be a couple of 100 years later now. John chapter 10 and verse 22. And it's called Hanukkah. That's the feast of Hanukkah, which was just celebrated, remember. If you pay any attention to newspapers or children in school or whatever, by Jewish people not that long ago, just a month or so ago. It's also called the Feast of Lights. That seems to have come from Josephus, because he said there were lots of lamps always lit at that time of the year. So it got its name Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. But it's known in the New Testament as the Feast of Dedication or the Feast of Rededication. So in other words, you'd kind of need an extra biblical reference there in John 10:22, and that would have to be 1 Maccabees 4:59 to know that traces you immediately back to 1 Maccabees chapter 4 and verse 59. We go on with the next couple of verses. Then I said that's also seen in 2 Maccabees 10 verses 1 to 8. Same account, 2 Maccabees 10 verses 1 to 8. Now we've already given you chapters 1 through 8 now. We skipped over chapter 9 because chronologically it's out of order here. And a problem we pointed out with this passage when we taught 2 Maccabees in the lit class was verse 3. This is an error made by the author of the book, that there was only a 2-year period of time. You see that in the middle of verse 3, 2 whole years before the temple was restored. But we know it was 3 years, so that's a chronological mistake in 2 Maccabees. Okay, one more thing and we'll stop with this tonight then. We're coming to our 5th campaign. That 4th one's the most important so far because they get their temple, they get their city back, and they have sacrifice restored. The 5th place, we would have to call this scattered battles against the surrounding Gentile forces. Not necessarily does that always have to do with the Syrians. Scattered battles against the surrounding Gentile forces. Seen primarily in 1 Maccabees 5, which I will quickly outline for you. 1 Maccabees chapter 5. Verses 1 and 2. Because Judas has liberated Jerusalem and Judea from Syria, We read there that his success makes the surrounding Gentiles furious, and they want to exterminate the people. First two verses. Verses 3 through 8, Judas goes to war against the Edomites. He goes to war against the Edomites. And then he hears of a bad state of affairs in both Galilee and Gilead. This is something I've mentioned before tonight. Verses 9 through 15. Verses 9 through 15. He has Jerusalem here. He's gone to battle the Edomites down here. Meanwhile, he hears bad state of affairs for the Jews up here in Galilee and over here in Gilead on the other side of the Jordan River. So he's going to pick brothers of his, and they're going to attack these places and secure the Jewish people there. So he sends Simon in verses 16 through 23. He sends Simon to fight against the Gentiles in Galilee. So you connect Simon with Galilee. And what's very interesting, to rescue the Jews and replant them in Judea, the southern part of Israel. To actually bring the people back bodily and replant them, repopulate Judea. That's verses 16 through 23. And then from verse 17, Judas and his brother, this goes all the way down through verse 44, I believe, all the way through 44. Judas and his brother Jonathan are going to go and attack Gilead. Let's see, Simon ends in 24 is what I mean, 24 through 44. Meanwhile, Judas Maccabaeus and his brother Jonathan cross the Jordan River, and they head towards Gilead, 24 through 44. They bring these Jews to Judea as well, verses 45 through 54, after a few initial difficulties in one particular town. And then in this concluding section, from verse 55 through verse 68 of chapter 5, deals with two more things. Verses 55 through 62, the success of Simon, Jonathan, and Judas encourages the Jewish leaders who've been left in control of the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem to go out and try to win some battles on their own. Verses 55 through 62. And then from verse 63 through 68, we just have praise of Judas and his men for all their exploits.